of capitalism-driven and overly aggressive consumerism culture, which has over the past 50 years precipitated the effects of climate change? How might capitalism adapt to be more mindful of the environment and factors like social mobility and income inequality? Well, that is what we're going to explore in our next session, Capitalism in the Age of Sustainability. And joining us as our panel members, we have with us Mr. Vikas Garg, CEO and founder at A Billion, Mr. Shailendra Tipparaju, Venture Partner, Dallas Venture Capital, Mr. Prashant Maniar, Managing Partner, Incyto Advisors, and Thai Mumbai Chapter Charter Member. And moderating the session, we have Editor-in-Chief for Entrepreneur Media APAC, Ms. Ritu Marya. May I request the moderator to kindly take things forward.
Thanks, Amina, and a very good morning from India, where I am based, to all the audience who are there with us today. I've been given one of the most interesting subjects to talk about today, which is about capitalism and sustainability. From my lenses, when I talk about it as an editor of Entrepreneur magazine, I feel that, both sort of conflict with each other. We want capitalism because that's what keeps us sustainable. That's what keeps us our paycheck coming every month. And at the same time, sustainability is almost an antithesis to capitalism if we really want this earth to be a better place. Now, how can we sort of bridge the gap? How can we balance it out and ensure that, we have best of both the worlds? This is really what is going to be a very interesting discussion with the stellar panel that I have with us today, which is actually joined us from virtually all parts of the world. So we've got Shailu, who is joined us from Chicago, I believe. And, he's going to tell us more about how he feels or how he thinks about sustainability, particularly from an global lens, and how US has taken lead in terms of sustainability and what they're doing. Vikas is joining us from Singapore today, and he's going to also talk about food sustainability. But what is most interesting is that, probably if somebody has understood sustainability in a small environment is Singapore. And, I would love for Vikas to tell us more about, as a country, how can you be more sustainable even when you're small, and can that small example actually be taken in some form to the rest of the world, and what we can take learnings from there. And then, of course, we have Prashant. Prashant's joining us from India, and he's going to talk about, entrepreneurship, which is absolutely a native of capitalism. How can entrepreneurship be driven in a manner that sustainability can also be driven as a byproduct? So I'm going to start this interesting conversation with here. Now, as I said, capitalism is about growth. So, we cannot have it, and it means to grow and to grow fast. That's what capitalism stands for fundamentally. That's the value system of capitalism. Now, this does not agree so much with sustainability, which wants you to use your products, your resources much more wisely than we would be otherwise doing. So I'm going to touch about at least 4 factors over here when we talk about capitalism and sustainability. One is going to be the human capital and how we can use which is in fact the biggest resource that we have, and how we can use it wisely. How do we make ecological resources? How do we use them wisely with trying to balance both capitalism and sustainability? Manufacturing, because that is of course vital to our consumption. So how can we make manufacturing more sustainable? And at the last, probably financial side of it. And, because finance drives entire capitalism and would also be needed to drive sustainability. So how can we have more financial sustainability in the ecosystem? Now, given these 4 pillars in mind, I'm going to drive this discussion with this stellar panel. So starting with you, Shailu, I know that you're doing some extensive work in the education sector. One, we would of course like for you to elaborate a little more on that. And secondly, I would also want to know that particularly education is the driver of sustainability, perhaps in some ways, because that is where our future generations are going to get ready from. And to get our future generations ready to think sustainable, to drive sustainability, what is it that the education sector can do to drive this sustainability right from in the young minds of our children? And not just in big countries and developed countries like US, but also in underdeveloped countries like Africa, and also in developing countries like India, China, and so on. So I'm going to pass this on to you.
No, thank you very much for kicking off a very relevant topic. and your insights in starting the session are very, very heartwarming to listen, and also would love to participate because personally, as an educator, I have other roles as an entrepreneur, as an investor, and most important between the three is I'm a family man. And I think we need to apply not a balance between these two, which puts things at the either ends, but as a harmony of it's a continuum. You mentioned about what is the educator's role, a family person's role in the industry that is fundamentally defined, talked about at length. I think sustainability is, in a direct sense, if you look up Google, it has a billion records, which means there's a lot of noise, there's no signal. But very simply put, sustainability in the educator's eyes is responsibility. From the early age in the academics to the early age in enterprise, be it startups to growing companies, we are taught to survive. From survival, go to significance. Between the two, how do we have the harmony of sustainability as a theme? How do we put values before valuations, which is how do we manage that consumption? How do we look at this from a social angle, from an economics angle, from an environmental angle? To your point, Ritu, you had mentioned about the context of each geography has their own way of approaching at this thing, but there are undercurrents and fundamental things that are very similar. When we talk about the social angle, what we are doing in our arena as educators is look at the curriculum that is being given from a K to 12 early stage in the higher ed as they enter into career. And after they entered into career, what are they doing in the enterprise to be socially responsible, economically responsible, environmentally responsible? There is definitely a lot of lip service that is played. There's a lot of greenwashing, if that's a term that's familiar for some folks here. We just have to step back and say, are we taking concrete steps? And these discussions are the beginning of such steps. So let's look at the social for just a minute. We need to apply ethical best practices in, are we establishing the proper governance models, monitoring models, and measurement models to see, have we baselined the definition? Have we baseline progress? Have we baseline measurement across each geographies? There's a fierce competitiveness even across continents. I travel multiple in my teaching responsibilities, and I see that in one sense there's a healthy competition, but on the other end there's also the dominance that is inherent between geographies to say who's the superpower of sustainability, if it's ironic enough. And we just have to say, are we sharing socially? How are we building the society as a community together with sustainability at the heart of it? Fundamentally, business in its base sense, economic growth is relevant and important for us to go as a society to the next step. But if we do not protect tomorrow at the price of our sustenance today, and we forget the lessons of yesterday, that comes at a very heavy price. So growth is required, but I think an organic growth in the relevant sense of education applied on what cost are we paying to grow as an economy? What cost are we paying as far as relationships between each other as nations, between each other as people, between each other as communities? And third, I think environmental awareness comes at many, many dimensions. There is more awareness of people having to recycle. There's more awareness of companies doing green initiatives. And I will definitely hear from my colleagues, Prashant and Vikas, on innovators, entrepreneurs, investors are now doing impact investing to be very, very particular on, are our investments very, very deliberate in where we are putting our investments? Is net zero just a flashy item on the PowerPoint by the company, or are they doing very, very concrete steps in the net zero? Are they providing measurement metrics to us? So I think to your question on a broad sense, what makes me happy, I will mention that first as an educator, is the awareness has begun. The solutions only come when there's awareness. The solutions take shape when there's education, and the solutions are measurable when there's action. All three of these are happening at a global context. And from my perspective, I'm very actively engaged in delivering this. In fact, part of my company's mission on the Green Zone project that we have begun starts at the academic level, goes to the enterprise level, and is actively engaged in investments companies such as Examity on education or Whistle Drive in transportation, we are very consciously asking the CEOs, please provide what have you done as a company to provide a green footprint to protect tomorrow, and how can you continue to deliver that message internally to your organizations, externally to your partners, and participate in conversations like these to share your wealth. With that, I'll pause and see if there's any follow-ups, Ritu. Thank you.
Sure. I love your point about thinking value before valuations, and I think it is so important if we really want to drive sustainability today in the larger context of the economy. But yes, of course, it has to be driven in our young minds for it to really take shape in the years to come. It's not a short haul process for sure, sustainability or driving sustainability. It's going to take a long time for it to happen, and the sooner or the younger we start, the better. So thanks for that, Shailu. Prashant, I'm going to come over to you. Now, capitalism find its a foundation in entrepreneurship. So people are entrepreneurial, and therefore they end up building, million, billion, trillion dollar enterprises. Now, but do you fundamentally feel that current entrepreneurship, which is driving growth to happen at a 10x, 100x, or whatever rate that you can think of today, is counterproductive to sustainability, because we are trying to grow too fast as a world, as a universe. We want to get on Mars when we've not even covered the whole Earth over here. So, and fundamentally what happens is, it is not about what we are finding further, but what we are leaving behind. We have created so many resources and spent millions and billions of dollars doing that, driving entrepreneurship. And capitalism itself is becoming or coming into a very short cycle. The spurts of capitalism, they're becoming short. We see that, we must have spent like $1 trillion in terms of oil drilling. And suddenly when we're now overpricing oil, we are saying that don't use oil or don't use petrol. Go on to electric vehicles. But I'm quite for it. It's a renewable form of energy, and we should be using that. But what about the investments that have already gone into drilling of oil and gas? What about that? I mean, is that sustainable to leave all those or forget about all those investments and start now driving onto another ledger? Is this kind of entrepreneurship, and particularly these short spurts of good capitalism, counterproductive to sustainability, according to you?
Well, Ritu, first of all, thank you to you and Tai for having me on this panel. Really excited to participate with Vikas and Shailu. And the questions you asked, actually, I just counted there about 9 different panel discussions. And, I would love to have you on some of those as well. And, Shailu also brought in the notion of impact investing versus, regular investing. So I think each of them are very, very big topics. Each of them deserve their own conversations. So I'll try at a higher level to address some of these and probably add some more points during the rest of the discussion. Just to start with, you mentioned that capitalism being the driver and sustainability as a byproduct. I think that, where we are pushing for, and a lot of people in this conference are pushing for, is that sustainability is going to be the driver, and capitalism is going to enable that key driving force in making sure that our planet is habitable, healthy for future generations, right? I think that's the central theme. And if I just take a quick step back, right? I mean, capitalism we define as private profit maximization, okay, at a very fundamental level. And if I take profit, and it's what Shailu talked about, value add. That's where profits come. Profits accrue to people who add value. And private, by definition, is entrepreneurship, right? Because every private enterprise begins as an entrepreneurial venture, right? Nobody's born as a large public company. And historically, it is true that capitalism, all the examples you gave about oil and fossil fuels, etc., were utilized to drive growth, right? At the cost of the environment, at the cost of planet, at the cost of sustainability. But, and therefore, it was also hampering long-term sustainability of humankind. But now let's take back to, the notion of entrepreneurship, okay? Entrepreneurship is not about just starting companies. There's a fundamental behind it, which is solving a problem. And today, one of the greatest problems that faces humankind is climate change and sustainability of the planet.
Yeah.
And actually, I think that that's where, entrepreneurship is coming up, that entrepreneurs are recognizing this as a problem. We're no longer in denial, right? I mean, if I look back when, Vice President Al Gore came out with, he got a Nobel Prize, he came out with the movie and Inconvenient Truth, etc. We are still in denial. We're still talking about what's going to happen 20 years down. But today, that reality is already come. Today we are talking of, we are talking of net zero, but there are actually people saying now, and with credible data, that we are already past a little bit of net zero. We actually have to be net negative, and we can talk a little bit about that as well. But so I think these solutions are not necessarily going to come out of the blue. It's going to be entrepreneurs driving it. It's going to be corporations taking responsibility. To Vikas's point, it's going to be consumers reducing the usage of things that harm our planet. And it's going to be about financiers enabling that transition to these types of elements. But to me, again, it goes back to entrepreneurships, right? Entrepreneurs are going to drive this change. And I believe that, I don't believe that entrepreneurship, capitalism, sustainability are in conflict. In fact, given this recognition of the problem, they are actually in concert.
That's great. And I'm gonna come back on detail on this, but whose responsibility is it to drive sustainability? Is it the government's responsibility? Is it entrepreneurs' responsibility? Is it is it a common man's responsibility? Whose responsibility is to drive? And at what level?
Well, let me take a simple example. Whose responsibility is to keep our own home and offices clean? Everybody's, right? So if we say government is going to do it, okay, well, why should they? Well, if we say the business has to do it, well, they want to do profits, right? It's actually human beings. We are at the top of the food chain, right? We are actually, the biggest drivers of this planet. It's everybody's responsibility in their own regard. So, if it's a consumer, we have to reduce our usage. If it's a business, we have to be responsible for that. And, people use what we call EPR, extended producer responsibility, for that. If it's governments, they have to put in the right regulation, the policies to enable businesses, people, consumers, whatever, to be able to participate in that through regulation, through support structures, through subsidies, through enablement across the value chain. And, if it's for the financiers, it's their responsibility to ensure that enough capital is available to make this transition happen.
But do you think going forward, we need to plan this a little ahead? We pretty much know that, we're not left with much petrol or gas reserves for our future generations. And we've understood that now. But don't you think this planning should have been done when we were manufacturing cars left, right, and center? To know that this problem would come. And, okay, anyway, let's say that you were right when Al Gore said that this was probably a 30 years forward problem. But is it important to realize this today? Let's think of a simple thing like plastic bags. We know it's bad for the environment. It's bad for our waters. It's bad for, it doesn't decompose. But nevertheless, while everybody's saying use less plastic, why can't we just stop plastic production? That would be an easier answer. So, but it hampers entrepreneurship and capitalism. So nobody's government is stepping forward and doing it.
This is such a interesting emotional, financial, and from this touches on so many aspects, and we have a lot of debates around it. The same issue of fossil fuels versus clean energy. It's the same issue of plastics versus not using plastics. And while I am fully, our whole business and life is dedicated to sustainability, we can't say we will stop using fossil fuels today. We can't say we are going to stop using plastics because, so for example, renewable energy today accounts for 25.6% of all energy consumption or generation in India, right? It's about 100 to 130 gigawatts, depending on who you ask. Well, if we stop fossil fuel usage, what will happen to industry? We will crash, right? So there is always a particular timeline of adoption. Now, the same thing with plastics, right? I think there's about 150 million tons of plastics in the oceans today. And if we stop using plastics, what are we going to do? Now, I know people are using very innovative techniques of degradable organic matter to replace plastics. But until that comes into play through adoption, through reduction in prices, etc., we can't just stop using plastics. Now, can we reduce using single-use plastics? Absolutely, we should. Can we use more recycled plastics? Like, garbage bags, right? From recycled plastics are abundantly available. They're actually equal or lower cost than traditional plastics. So yes, those will happen. but I don't think that you can, it's like a light bulb that you can switch on and off. I think there is a transition to that.
Sure.
And may I button for 1 second? I mean, as an educator, I was mentioning before we began that we are professional listeners, but there is a time when the voice of the teacher has to step up. I think none of these solutions, and Prashant, beautiful way of expressing many dimensions. Ritu had 9 questions, you had 90 dimensions of answers with data. That's very refreshing. None of these answers are binary. I think none of these are use this, don't use this. The entrepreneurs definitely are in the driver's seat. There's a lot of passengers who are consumers who are waiting for the value to be consumed. Who is the owner of the bus? Who's laying the path for the bus? And who's taking responsibility? Rather than using that word, if you use accountability, then the self-regulation will come in. And it's not, I'm a 1 person in a 7 billion person planet, so maybe I can get away with doing something that's not responsible is okay. But when you apply self-regulation and accountability, it is a bottom up at a micro level. Since we are now aware, we are taking small micro steps. At a macro level, I think definitely there has to be an initiative from the manufacturers of the bus in the probably a sense. Larger bodies have to say, hey guys, these are some guidelines. Let's give you some GPS to get in these directions. These are do not go paths. But you just can't shut down the roads of consumption of a particular product and say, suddenly we're going to get better. It may actually make us not so better, but actually worse because it directly impacts some industries, but it has a transition phase to it. And I think as you enter into the third panelist who will talk about where are the driver dependent consumers sitting in the seats and what is their consumer habits, entrepreneurs are actually gravitating towards solving problems that consumers consume. How is that dimension? But let's wait for those discussions. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Shalu. And so let me jump over to Vikas. Vikas, thank you for joining us from Singapore. Now, Singapore has probably shown some great resilience when it comes to becoming sustainable. And, they've been able to take far more steps. Of course, the size of the country is also very friendly when it comes to making changes and shifts in the larger scheme of things. But, my question to you is that particularly, and this is an off-take from what I asked Prashant, whose responsibility is to drive sustainability? Is it, so consumers have to do it, and today we are sitting in a consumerism society. It is something we've created ourselves as a world. We wanted to buy more, we encouraged people to buy more, our entire marketing advertising industry runs on it. So how can now buying more is not something that is going to go away. So how is it that we going, as Shadow also put it, how do we become more self-regulated? And who's, again, particularly from your point of view, as you've looked at Singapore, whose responsibility has been to drive sustainability in the country and how they've been able to do it so well?
So I don't think any of us are here to save the planet. The planet doesn't need to be saved, right? Like the planet is 4.5 billion years old. And human beings, modern human beings have been on the planet, have been on Earth for 200,000 years. Animals have been on the planet, there's, single cell organisms have been on the planet for 600 million years. So 200,000 years, and capitalism has existed for 400 or 500 years. And, so the Earth is going to be fine. It's whether we are going to have a role in being on the Earth for how much longer is what sustainability is, right? Our human definition of sustainability is how long can we consume, how long can we create the constructs so we can continue to consume without, the Earth fighting back and pushing back. That's really all it is, right? So it's like, it's really just us fighting the natural flow of things, right? And natural response. And that's what we're seeing with climate change, right? We're just seeing that we actually can't fight back. The fires are bigger than ever. The weather patterns are colliding. So you've got hurricanes and you've got, droughts and all of this stuff that are just getting magnified. The seasons are getting magnified. There's things that we just can't control. And look, Singapore is an amazing place to create a company, but in many ways we also live in a bubble where we are sheltered from a lot of these realities that the rest of the world is facing, in terms of climate refugees, in terms of insanely adverse weather conditions, if you even call things like forest fire weather, or drought, or many of the other things. I mean, Singapore imports 90% of the food that it eats, and I think that the reality is here that nearly everybody we sit in a part of the world that's very affluent, in air-conditioned buildings, eating arugula from Italy. So, even plant-based burgers that are manufactured in California and then flown over here on an airplane. So I think, I think that there's a reality to sustainability, and there's even with consumers, there's a lot of education. And Shiloh touched on education, of course, talked about education. And I think education and food are two basic human rights, right? That we tend to think about. They kind of go hand in hand. I sometimes wonder, can you get an education without food? And sometimes I wonder, can you get food without an education, right? It's like they're so important and vital to everybody. So when I think of sustainability and I think of the role of government, and this panel and capitalism at the end of the day is a construct, right, to shift industrialization, manufacturing from the public sector to the private sector. And that's really all it is, right? And so far we have not really seen an alternative that's worked, I think, anywhere in the world in the last 100 years. So it's what we've got, right? And we kind of have to go with it. I guess for me, the challenge is that we as people are so conditioned today to believe and feel that somebody else is going to take care of it, right? So we've got a problem. We think we've identified it, and whether it's somebody's going to create medicine for me to take, or somebody's going to solve that problem, or somebody's going to take out the trash, or somebody's going to make sure, like there's adequate food and shelter and all of this stuff to kind of go around. We're conditioned to think that other people are going to take care of the problems, right? The reality is that government today is not going to do that. Government and policymakers, anytime I ask anybody, can you tell me anything that has happened substantive from the Paris Climate Accord, right? No, there's no response. There's no response, right? Because nobody knows. So all these people, the policymakers, the government officials, they all go to these places, these fancy places, and meet up, and they do nothing, right? Or they create policies that they say, okay, yes, we've made a promise to go this free by 2035. It's like, okay, great. So the reality is, today we have this new thing that has been created, and it's also kind of one of these, for better or worse, things, right? In fact, in the last 24 or 48 hours, we've seen quite a lot of information and news come out about Facebook. But social media has leveled the playing field for information spreading around the world. Good information, bad information, misinformation, good, all sorts of information. But it's really empowered a whole new generation of people to share information with each other. And it's extremely, extremely powerful, right? So information is spreading around the world. Governments can no longer control it, right? It's a very, very, very exciting time. And it's also very scary in many ways. So when you kind of look at who the responsibility then comes on, you now have people who are more educated and informed, better informed than they ever have been in history, right? The general population of people. And it's people who are going to drive, if we're living in a capitalist society where the manufacturers are private businesses and they need to sell an end product. So they have customers. And if those customers are rapidly changing and evolving, their demands, they're going to have to change. They're not going to be able to wait, or, and the ones that do will get left behind. So this is where it gets really, really exciting from a consumer perspective, because we think that the entire sustainability movement for the next 20 or 30 years, for the last 20 or 30 years, if you talked about sustainability, you were thinking immediately, the thing that snapped to your mind was fossil fuels. And we think that for the next 20 or 30 years, fossil fuels is not this thing that like most consumers understand, right? Like people don't know what carbon offset means. They don't know, they don't get it, right? I don't get it. So like if I don't get it, how is the average person supposed to understand what a carbon offset means, right? What they know is, oh, maybe they should travel less, right? Or maybe they should live more sustainably, or they should consume more sustainably. And they're intrigued and they're interested, right? Or maybe they shouldn't buy things with as much plastic. So we're really excited because we think that consumerism is going to be the biggest component of this global sustainability megatrend for the next 20 or 30 years. How people, and right at the center of that is the thing that we all of humanity does every single day. In fact, there was a Cornell study 15 years ago that said that people think about and make decisions around food 250 times a day, right? So it's constantly on our minds. When I wake up in the morning, I'm thinking about what I'm going to eat for lunch and where I'm going to go and who I'm going to see and what I'm going to eat and all this stuff, right? Constantly on our minds, right? And so we think what's at the center of people's plates can play a really big role. And if you look at these 17 sustainability development goals that the United Nations has crafted, there's more than a dozen of them that a shift to more sustainable food practices can really target, whether it's food wastage or it's food inequality. You know, we have 1 billion people around the planet who will not eat today. We have 1 billion people who are malnourished or will not eat today. And we have 1 billion people who are obese and have too much to eat, right? The largest single cause of deforestation globally is animal agriculture. The largest consumer of water globally is animal agriculture. The largest consumer of arable land in the United States are animals, are cattle, not people, right? And food grown for those people. And you could take all of the corn that's grown in America and just take half of it. Just take half the corn that's grown in America that goes to feed cattle, right? And animals. And you could feed all of the 1 billion hungry people around the planet, right? But you don't have to tear down the Amazon rainforest anymore and cause all of these super cycles of climate change and everything, right? So it doesn't require the whole world to go vegan. It's not about that. But if we all can just be more mindful about what we put on our plate, and we can inject some sense of consciousness around that consumer decision, we think that that has massive catapult effects. Because anytime you inject some sense of consciousness into a practice and make it into a practice, something that you're doing so repetitively, it then just permeates through the rest of your life. And that's what we're really excited about.
You know, I buy your point on, creating food for all is important. And, we need to, and the world needs to balance itself out in terms of the plate. But, is anybody also thinking about, while creating food for all, it's about what we are consuming? Is that sustainable for human bodies in the long run? About, food which is full of fertilizers, food which is full of chemicals.
Absolutely.
This was not made for our bodies at all in the first place. So it's, the food that we're eating is actually not sustainable for us. Yeah,
absolutely. We have this massive debate today around vaccinations, right? And people are terrified about getting vaccinated. But like 80% of antibiotics and vaccinations that are manufactured by the healthcare industry get injected into animals, right? That you eat. 80% globally. So we're constantly eating and drinking vaccinations and antibiotics and hormones and growth hormones and all of this stuff. And that's what's causing the cancers and the heart problems and the cholesterol and the chronic inflammation and all of it, right? Yeah. So absolutely. There's a massive natural foods movement, right? There's a massive movement in terms of cleaner eating. I think these are things to get very excited about. Now, access to food is a real challenge. Access to affordable, healthy food is a real challenge in many places around the world.
In all places around the world. Yeah. And the problem is that we are very, very less aware of that. We think about that there is less food for people, but what we're not thinking is that the more food that is there, it might actually not be that good for us at all. So we then have a big healthcare issue that is anyway bubbling up all the time. But anyway, coming back to the discussion, now I've understood one thing if I have looked at government regulation, and we understand that a large part of it in terms of, we think that about the world countries and the government thinking on sustainability, as you mentioned about the Paris, the Paris conference as well. So lies with the government. And rightly so in some ways, because, they are able to take a more macro picture of things. But the fact is, how does the government and what are best practices around the world, which we might or you might have observed, where governments have been able to play a key role in driving
taxation. I grew up in New York City in the 1980s, and I learned about recycling because when we went, we bought soda because we thought soda was great and healthy, right? And Coca-Cola had the best commercials, and so we used to drink a lot of sugared soda, and in the summertime in a hot climate in New York, whatever, we used to drink a lot, and we'd save up all of the cans, and then at the end of the summer, my mom and dad would say, you take all these cans to the grocery store and you put them into the machine, boom, 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 and you get 10 cents back for every can. And that was how we learned about recycling. Like, why are we doing this, right? When you had the tobacco lawsuits in America from 1994 to 96, there was a massive shift in consumer awareness. But then it was also coupled with heavy taxation of tobacco, really, really heavy taxation for tobacco in many states. And so again, that created not only an awareness, but it immediately stung you in your pocket, right? And impacted consumer behavior. And, until the rise of vaping, we pretty much saw massive decline in teenage smoking rates. So I think taxation is really effective, and it needs to be driven. That's one thing that needs to be driven by government. The challenge, of course, speaking purely from, with any sort of industry, with a lot of the manufacturing industries, the old manufacturing industries, whether it's fossil fuels or food, right, or agriculture, they're heavily, heavily, heavily subsidized, right? So the cost to the consumer is so much lower than the actual cost of the production and the distribution of that product. For example, the price of a gallon of milk in America hasn't really changed very much in the last 20 or 30 years, right? There's a reason for that. I mean, the actual cost of that gallon of milk is much, much, much higher. So I think that's also one of the unique challenges that we're fighting, is that, like, when you deal with these industries, they have the biggest lobbyists, they have the biggest governmental control in a way. It's very hard to kind of move the needle in the other direction from a governmental perspective, because the industry groups are so strong. It's a very unique challenge. Even in the tobacco industry, it took such a long time, right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So, Ritu, I'd love to jump in. I'd love to jump in here because, having worked on so many projects that are related to governments, we look at it from a government policy, and, I actually appreciate Vikas's point on taxation. But now let's look at from an implementation standpoint, and, what seems to have worked and what doesn't seem to have worked. In my opinion, what seems to have worked is a couple of different points. One is, massive goal setting, right? The government setting a lot of, massive goals in what you need to accomplish towards sustainability. And for example, in 2014 or sometime thereafter, Modi ji announced that, look, we're going to do 175 gigawatts of renewable power, right? And if you look at the 2020 numbers, we are already between 100 to 130 gigawatts. Now, in 2015, I was on a panel and a reporter got up at the Q&A session and said, well, does this even make sense to you? And my answer to that person was, look, I would rather have a 175 gigawatts goal and accomplish 50 to 70% of that, which is statistically what happens to goals when you set goals and you accomplish 50 to 70%, rather than a 30 gigawatts goal and accomplish 100% of that, right? Because what that does is it requires industry, entrepreneurs, governments to think differently. So that's one element that I love about, how governments can support, sort of the whole transition to sustainability. The second one.
Any other country example you want to cite, which maybe a China model or something?
Well, no, the second one is what I was going to talk about. For example, I think it's the EU, which has now said, look, we're going to spend $1.75 trillion on sustainability, right? So that enables sort of the goals, enables the goals being realized. The next one is incentives, right? So for example, and you mentioned the EVs, I'll bring in that topic here. In the EVs globally, there are tons and tons of incentives. For example, I think in California, the California Energy Program gives you, I think, a 10,000, I don't have the exact number up to date, but I think a $10,000 incentive on a $40,000 EV, right? Which, they're also willing to finance, right? So the government gives the incentive, CEP is willing to finance that. And
they also let you drive in the carpool lane, which
exactly.
For consumers stuck on the 405 in Los Angeles is pretty big.
Exactly. So that's part of the incentive. And the third one is, sort of self-transition. So, governments, like, again, I'll just come back to India. We have fleets and commercial buses, state transport, BST buses in Mumbai, for example. All of these, government bodies are saying, look, we understand that these things are expensive, but rather than just give subsidies or hand out money, we're going to come out with tenders where, entrepreneurs and businesses can bid for those, and, they automatically have a scale. So for example, I know there's one particular project which requires 2,000 EV chargers. Now that scale, private industry can't do, right? But a government body can, and that actually helps, move the scale up and helps people build those businesses. So I think these are areas where I feel that actual practical implementation of government regulation helps.
Sure. Shalu, I'm going to add in this regard another question, particularly from an education sector point of view. Do you think we need more harsher measures to be taken by the government? I know when China said one-child policy, it was a very, very harsh measure, but it actually set their population goals right. And sometimes you have to do those in order to get things right. I mean, from an education standpoint, if the schools were to, or the government was to step down and say, if kids have to come to school, they have to come in the school bus. Do you think we need such, regulations to be set for sustainability to be driven, and I mean really driven? I mean, it's okay to say that we will spend 1.75 trillion on, but it needs more harsher measures, and we have to live with it.
Harsher measures is a interesting term, Ritu. You mentioned, if we look at, there's an old saying in our tradition that you can wake up someone who's actually sleeping, but not someone who's pretending to be sleeping. I think one of our specialties as humans is we pretend to sleep when the problem is big enough. We plug in noise cancelling headphones when there's something on the street to absolve the responsibility of our accountability in there. I think there's three measures as I see as a teacher. And Vikas mentioned one, which is the penalty mode. Apply deep penalty to get them under check. There's something Prashant mentioned, which is the incentive. These are two, will see instant results or immediate results, but have a long-term impact. We are, as humans, a 200,000-year-old against a 4 billion size entity. So the minute you apply stringent measures, we have figured out creatively how to go around them as soon as that pressure is taken off. If you take out the incentive, our initiative goes down. If you take out the penalty, we get back to it. So the interesting thing to apply is education as a theme. I think collectively we all agree that something that sustains long-term in the interest of the topic sustainability is, how do we teach compassionate capitalism? How do we teach empathy? How do we sponsor those events? And the very tools that Vikas mentioned, which is decentralized information tools, how do we use them for deliberate awareness of these? We are monitored for everything we see. Everything we look up, we get a product that is actually pushing us to buy more, consume more. How do we reverse channel that and apply that to say, if I look up for something, what if those are not allowed to push so much of products on our mind space, because that draws into the purse instantly. So we need to put regulations around that, but directly applying stringent penalty and incentive in the short term is a definite win. We do need that, with an ongoing undercurrents of that values, which is be responsible for your great-great-grandchildren that you don't see right now at the cost of buying the third noise cancelling headset. Do you have the maturity to think about that? And if they say, I don't care for someone who's unborn, let me keep consuming until I can consume. If it's healthcare, if it's food, a very valid topic that Vikas has brought. If it is initiative on how we move from place to place, I mean, that's a very simple example. Let's take transportation as a single one. We think by sitting at home during the pandemic, we have saved carbon emissions and saved the planet. We have not done that. Data centers are burning through incredible amount of energy to keep us running and run these sessions. So there's a false comfort that we create this lullaby and go to sleep, that we have now stopped emitting gas. Oh, great. We are sitting on digital transformation and now we have saved the planet. I think what we as humans have done is comforted ourselves into new models, pretending that we have moved the problem. We have not solved the problem, that moved the problem. If we talk about electric vehicles, the amount of metals that extracted on the earth to create these batteries of lithium is not small. It's a staggering amount of extraction that happens. We're just talking data extraction and custom recommendations of which movie to watch comes at a phenomenal data center processing power that is directly consuming what? The energy. So I think these dimensions are what we need to bring into primary education, into higher education, into career education and enterprise education, and say, guys, you are aware, you heard about it on the thing. Before you buy a product, before Amazon recommends me to buy something else that goes with it, they should say the carbon footprint of this is this much, the cost of earth is this much. And Vikas is right, we are not here to save the earth. Earth doesn't need us, we need earth. The problem is we are interfering in the process and accelerating something that's not natural. So we are the unnatural entity in a natural flow. No animal has consumed the way it consumes. We consume for 5 generations from now. We accumulate for 10 generations from now. No animal ever created in millions of years saves for the future. An ant does it maybe 6 months. We save for 600 years. But that's where the passion of the educator comes in, saying, let's bring it to the curriculum of this as a topic in early stage. If you put it into the minds of 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds, we don't need penalties. We don't need incentives. They'll just do it because it's the right thing to do.
Correct.
Therein lies the teacher's voice.
Sure. So, I know we're almost at the end of the time, but I want to touch a very important aspect, which is the human capital. And human capital in the times of capitalism and when we're thinking sustainability. Now, as capitalism sort of progresses very quickly, I'm beginning to see how quickly humans and their skills are becoming obsolete. A person who probably, if pandemic is any sort of statistical analysis tool to go by, then people above 50s probably lost more jobs than any other section of the society. And that's going to keep happening if we do not think. Now, you want a sustainable earth, and here there is a human at 50 who is scrambling to figure where my next paycheck is going to come from. So honestly, with all due respect to the governments, no human is going to think about sustainability. He's going to think about his paycheck, and he's going to give a damn about the carbon footprint and every other thing in the world till he doesn't feel that if he feels he's not able to make money. So now, how in the drive of capitalism do we keep our human capital prosperous? That's a very big question today, I think, which we need to answer, because as our capitalism is going stronger, as entrepreneurial initiatives of solving the world problems is becoming bigger, I am seeing a completely different problem, which is coming, that after 50, you might as well say retire at 50, because you're anyway, you're obsolete, you don't know stuff. So how is it? And much of it, of course, rests from the education sector. Either, we need to have an education blueprint being drawn where a person needs to go back to school compulsorily at 40 and do maybe an year or whatever, 1 year's course. And let's not leave it in the hands of self-regulation. That's very difficult to do. We cannot, when it comes to self-regulation, we've not been able to even drive the vaccination throughout the world quickly. So how can we make our human capital more agile? How can we make sure that if they're going to live till 80, 90 or whatever, they need to be active, they need to be doing stuff. Why is it that we are making our human capital obsolete, and what can be done to make that sustainable first? Anybody can take it up.
I'll take only 30 seconds. I think first by defining and removing the word resources and capital associated with people. I think that's the first step. We have started to see everything as a thing that is a resource or an investment or something that has to be processed, including we apply it at humans. So in an organization, we define people as a capital, as a way to optimize, squeeze it to max value. We need to figure out new taxonomy for that whole language that we use around people. I mean, what is a nation? What is a community? What are we? Just people. We're just humans. So if we redefine some of that thing, I think the empathy and compassion you talked about will come out. And then we can worry about their food, shelter, clothing, and their basic survival before we talk about save the planet. You're absolutely right. No one cares a damn about it if their basic survival is at risk. But once that is met, those humans have to be told your compensations, your growth, your performance won't be tied to consumeristic goals, which is more and more until there's never-ending goals. We need to dial that down and keep that as a mechanism. Easier said than done. But I think if startups are told, if you reach a certain level of growth, you need to apply this as a payback, give back, and how you treat your people without becoming the richest guy in the planet celebrated every minute. If we imbibe those values, I think that will be a starting step. Won't be a solution, but I'd love to hear what Vikas and Prashant have to share.
I think it's happening, you know, like in the 19th century, the beginning of the 19th century, 25% of women employed in the UK were hat makers, right? Like, and then there are another 25% were like glove makers. And then all those jobs got disrupted. Half of them moved to India, they moved to America, et cetera, right? And so it's like societies go through transformations, right? And you're seeing it today. Like, yeah, sure, there's people who are, the people who are not prepared are scratching their heads and wondering, oh my God, what am I gonna do, right? But like, there's also, I hear stories all the time of very active people who are in their 70s and 80s and on their, you know, third or fourth job or company that they've created. And they're not necessarily like special or affluent or anything people. They're just people who, in a way, were raised a little bit differently or have a little bit of a different perspective on life, right? So it's like tough to generalize. And I don't think that it's I mean, people are different, right? We have this concept of survival of the fittest. Like some people are gonna really empower themselves and enable themselves, and other people are gonna complain and look for everyone else to kind of fix their problems, which is not gonna happen. And so they're gonna, you know, just kind of wither away complaining. So like, that's just the way that things work. We have this massive move around the world to freelance jobs, totally new economy, and ditching, you know, younger people are not obsessed with, you know, past generations' obsession with working in, or the constructs of working at the same company for 25 years, collecting a pension, and then, you know, having that pension and retiring and living another 15, 20 years. People just don't think like that anymore. So, you know, you have this massive freelance and gig economy industry that's sprouting up all around the world. And you know, some people, a lot of those people realize it's like, wow, okay, I just, my new normal is I have to work 2 jobs, or I'm going to be working 2 different jobs, right? And that doesn't make me a worse person or less well off. That helps me gain an edge and learn different things. And I don't know if going back to school, I think school can be a huge waste of time for a lot of people. But like, you know, university education especially, but like the people, yeah, training is really important. When I left the industry that I was in, which was finance, and started a technology company, I enrolled in a 3-month-long full-time coding boot camp. And it wasn't because I thought that I was going to go and build this thing myself, my company, and program V1 or any of that stuff. I just felt like I needed to have a better, deeper sense and appreciation for what engineers go through and do if I'm going to work with engineers. So I think it's about shaping people, giving them the right tools. And a lot of our educational systems that are focused on rote learning and memory don't necessarily do that. right? So getting people at a younger age out there and kind of experiencing work, I think, is also very, very valuable.
But that I feel it needs a more formal system to be created, instead of just hoping that everybody is going to have that sort of light about what is right for them, sitting at 20 and going to 50.
Well, I would love for the Singapore government to create a really great system that helps me get interns, but they haven't, and so I just do it myself. And I've probably given 100 high school students and college students here in Singapore jobs in the last 4 years, and we probably hired about 10% of those people into full-time roles in the company. So like, I think there's plenty of businesses that are leading by example, doing things and giving people opportunities. And we just need more of that. We need a lot more of that.
Would you be happy to take an intern who is 75 years old?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's what we need to do more. That's where I'm coming from, because we, as the earth is growing older, we need to do something for them. Prashant, final words from, go on. Sherry, you want to add something?
No, very important point to mention. These days, I think we are looking for the best person who can solve the problem that we have at hand, not defined by age, gender, their preference, their geography. I think that has evolved quite significantly. Absolutely agree with Vikas. We don't look at the age of the person, and it's real. We are actually taking that out in every policy as entrepreneurial initiatives inside companies. Bring the right person to the right need and keep them as long as they can solve the problem. This age is not even a factor anymore. I'm seeing it live action in at least 5 companies, and I think more of that will happen. So there's definitely good news for those watching this. If you feel age is a barrier, that is not the barrier. It is in fact a benefit, because the experience you bring. I will never learn from a teacher who's 16 years old, though they can teach so many things to circumvent the processes. I would be very happy to learn from a teacher who's 75. In fact, my teacher, Linda from Harvard, is 75. So she's the most ideal fit. She can handle a room of 75 people on her spell until she lets her off her spell. So I truly believe that. But sorry for last word from Prashant.
Yeah, Prashant, last to you. You need to unmute.
Thank you. No, I agree with both of these guys that age is just really a number. But when I look at sort of human capital development, I look at it from a 5-pronged standpoint, right? I mean, one of them is obviously upskilling yourself and education. Second one is upgrading yourself on technology. The third obvious one, obviously for me, is job creation, which does happen a lot through entrepreneurship and governments. And the last one is really finance. And we've touched upon finance, so I'll just bring that in really quickly. So if I look at it, UNPRI reported in March 2021 that the global initiatives that they had already had about 90 private equity firms whose total AUM was 700 billion. They're already registered for it, and they were gonna invest in companies which are focused on sustainability. So I think that when these companies are actually raising capital, they eventually create jobs, and when there are more jobs available, naturally people gravitate towards those jobs. And if they find that they're not skilled, they there are companies like, for example, in the education space, which like Byju's and so many others who provide that upskilling, that skill development out there. So I think if and then of course the technology platforms are out there to allow you to upskill yourself. So I think when you look at this from a 5-pronged standpoint, I think the opportunity is there. And age is just a number. And to Shalu's point, I learn as much from teenagers as much as I learn from people of every other age. So with that, I would say I think there's a lot of opportunity, and I come back to the point that I think entrepreneurship is going to drive sustainability.
Sure. Well said, Prashant. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for this talk. And this was really wonderful. I know this was more subjective, and a lot of things that we discussed are very, very subjective and would only see the light of the day when things are put more with some right numbers put into it, and governments taking more quantitative measures on this. But my 2 pence and what I've been able to drive out of this conversation is that on a micro level, to drive sustainability, we need every individual on this earth to be more self-regulated. whether it is about their food practices or whether it is about their carbon usage practices. They need to be aware, and they need to therefore be able to take decisions on how, even on a 1% or 2%, 5% level, whatever changes they will bring will only do good to the earth. On a more macro level, on the government, I think the panel has very rightly pointed out, a government needs a mix of penalty incentives and stringent measures to be put into place in order to really be able to drive the sustainability roadmap that they are looking for from their country's perspective, which will then of course benefit the earth in a large way. Overall, I think sustainability is not something that we can do away with and just discuss over here in boardrooms and feel that, well, it's wonderful, but what it really needs is some practices to come forward and put into place, and more sharing of good practices happening, particularly on social or wherever we can, so that everybody is able to gather those practices and use them. So thank you very much once again for joining us today, and thank you to TIE for organizing this sustainability conference. I think it's very vital as a subject, and it only go on to increase our levels of awareness about what we should be doing. Over to you, Samina.
We'd like to thank our moderator and our speakers for the thought-provoking discussion on capitalism in the age of sustainability. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of our morning session. We will be back at 5 p.m. Indian Standard Time, of course, with yet another interesting discussion on the key to creating sustainable water solutions. I'm going to request all our guests, all our delegates to kindly head to our official website for further details and all the information on all our upcoming sessions, our speakers, and of course our schedule. See you all at 5 p.m. Indian Standard Time. Until then, this is me, Samina, signing off.